Live. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we're all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. Today's a little bit of all three, which is really exciting. And so right now we're joined by 4 classes from across North America. I want to give them a chance to do a bit of a shout out before we dive in. We've got Miss Weaver's grade 6s in Ocean City in New Jersey. Hi, guys. Hey, welcome back from earlier. I love it. We've got Miss Nilvo's grade 3s in Los Lunas in New Mexico. Hi, guys. Hi. Hey, I like when people scream so loud that it like cuts short the mic in the computer. That's awesome. We've got Miss Melika's grade 5s in Ottawa, Ontario, right down the road from Paul. Hi, guys.
Huh? Say hi.
Yo, oh, hi, yo.
Hey. Yes, the cue is for you. And last but not least, we've got grade 10 through 12, Mr. Pone's class in At Glen in Pennsylvania. Welcome in, guys. Right. Hi, everyone. Oh, they're just cycling out. We got the new class coming in a second. Anyway, all right. The reason you guys are all here today is for our speaker. So we are joined live in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada by Dr. Paul Sokoloff. So he is a botanist at the Museum of Nature in Canada. It's one of the most iconic research and outreach facilities in the country. And he's going to tell us a little bit today about his Arctic expeditions to search for some really unique and fantastic plants and what it takes to get up there, and more about the awesome work that he does. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Sokoloff, and take us away.
Thank you so much, Jesse, and good morning/afternoon, everyone. I'm super excited to be here with you today. I'm coming to you from cold and snowy Ottawa. So, you see the snow on the branches out here. That's kind of what we're dealing with. And you might think the Arctic is a bit like that. However, when I go to the Arctic, it's a little different. So I'm going to kind of place that for you because I know that not everyone thinks a little bit about the Arctic. So I'm just going to switch over to my screen here and share my presentation. All right. This is what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking a little bit about plants and lichens. And I'm sure that most of you have thought a lot about plants, or maybe if you haven't, this will get you starting to think about plants as more than just, the trees and the grass and the flowers around us. But also I'm going to tell you a little bit about lichens, which are cool organisms that you may have talked about in your biology class already. So I want to talk first about what I do for work. Now, I'm a botanist, and you might ask yourself, well, what's a botanist? And unlike this person on the left here, I don't actually arrange flowers for a living, although that's a perfectly valid career choice. I would encourage anybody to go to. That's what a florist does. No, a botanist is somebody who's interested in the biodiversity of plants around us. What makes a different species, or where can we find different kinds of plants, and then communicating that both to other scientists and to the public in general. So no, I don't arrange plants, although after about 3 weeks in the field, I might start putting them on my head, as you can see here. We call that field brain. It happens when you've been up away from home for a long time. So what do I really do? Well, I spend most of my time actually looking at plants under microscopes. And that's actually what you see me doing here. I'm really trying to identify this grass species by looking at a pressed and dried specimen in my scope. And so, if you've seen a botanist and you see them surrounded by all sorts of living things, that's not really what I do. And I'll get into that in a second. All right, so I know we have a class from Ottawa, so you might recognize the building here. Wave if you recognize the Canadian Museum of Nature. Yeah, okay, so some people in Ottawa have been here. So this is our National Natural History Museum. So what we do is we have people who work on dinosaurs, like Jordan from earlier. We have people who work on minerals. And we also have people like me who are really, really interested in plants. And now I don't work at a castle, unfortunately. I work at our little building across the river here in Gatineau. But this is where we keep over 14.6 million specimens, sheets of grasses, dinosaur bones, fossils, meteorites, all sorts of things like that. And we keep them so that we can do research on them. By keeping a specimen, we can say that we found a particular species at a particular place at a particular time. All right, so that's what I do. I look at plants all day long, and honestly, I kind of like it. It's a fun job to have. Now I want to tell you a little bit about the Arctic. And so, you probably heard about the Arctic. We talk about the Arctic a lot because it's a place of change. This is probably what most of you think of when you think of the Arctic. You think of a big iceberg, you think of people going by in a boat, maybe tourists. And this is true. This is part of what the Arctic is, but it's not just snow and ice all the time. The Arctic is this massive part of our planet. And as such, it's got all sorts of little different environments all around it that we call different plant habitats. So if you can imagine your hometown, and you imagine that it's not the same throughout your hometown. There are different places where you find different types of trees, or there's gullies with rivers, or places are known to be warmer or colder. Well, that's true in the Arctic too. You can get little big shrubs, kind of like the lower part of the Arctic. You can get really, really barren areas where not much grows. And then you get things that look like flat prairies where you can watch your dog run away for 3 days. That's a Saskatchewan joke. I grew up on the prairies here, so it's a thing. But it's diverse. It's super geographically diverse across its range, and as such, it's got all sorts of different plants that we're interested in looking for. So how do you define the Arctic? Well, you might say that everything above the Arctic Circle is the Arctic, but if you're a botanist like me, you might actually think that everything above the tree line, and that's everything you see here in green, is Arctic. And in Canada and in Alaska, that's over 40% of everything above our land, our national area. So there's a huge area to cover here in terms of those different habitats. And so that's where we come in. We're interested in exploring these different areas above the tree line for what plant species you can find growing there. And for us, it's also really important to keep in mind that the Arctic isn't just an interesting place to do research. It's also the homeland for Inuit. So Inuit have been lived in Arctic Canada for thousands of years, since long before contact. And there are 4 big Inuit settlement regions within Arctic Canada: the Inuvialuit Settlement Region, Nunavut, Nunavik, and Nunatsiavut. And all across the north, they comprise what we call Inuit Nunangat, which is the Inuktitut language term for the Inuit homeland. So for us, it's important to realize that not only are we doing research in a cool area, but we're also working in someone's backyard too. And so it's very important to us to be respectful and to be as transparent as possible when we're doing our research. So how many different plants do you think you'd be able to find in the Arctic? Well, the answer is we think that in that area above tree line, there are about 800 different species. And we say we think because we still haven't explored all these different sites up in Arctic Canada. Every time we say a species grows in the Arctic, it's got one of these pressed plant specimens that backs it up. So I mentioned that we have 14.6 million natural history specimens here. About 1 million of those are these pressed and dried plants, and these little bundles called herbarium specimens. And each one of these sheets that contains a pressed plant has a label that shows where the plant was collected and when it was collected. And that essentially is the proof that we found a thing at a particular place at that time. And this is important for a few reasons. It's always good to go back and check your work and make sure that you identified something correctly the first time. But it also means that in the future, people can see, are things changing in the Arctic? So when we talk about climate change, specimens are what will really let us say, oh, well, are different species coming into the Arctic because we have that proof. And they're also what lets us say that we have about 800 different plant species in the Arctic. So if I were to take the coordinates on all of these herbarium labels and plot them up on a map, you can see that we've made a lot of collections in different parts of the Arctic. Each one of these red dots is a different specimen collected somewhere in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. And so there's lots of places that are really well collected. Like if you see right here where my cursor is, there's a place called Eureka. It's a high Arctic research hub. And so many people have been collecting there over the last 100 years, essentially. But there are other places where you don't see any collections. And so we use tools like this to help us determine, okay, where exactly are we going to go collecting in the future? So that's the fun part, really, because each one of those dots represents somebody going up and actually digging up the plant and bringing it back to Ottawa. And so that's my favorite part of the job, whereas maybe most of my job is looking at a computer screen. For a month every summer, when it's nice and warm up in the Arctic, me and my colleagues will get on a plane just like this one, and we'll head north into a different place where we're going to be collecting plants and lichens for a month on the land just by ourselves. So this is our team here. These are some of my colleagues, and it's very important to have a good group of people if you're going to be working with them and no one else for a month solid. In fact, having a good team is the make or break of field work, really. And so these people are all wonderful, and I'm very happy to be able to work with them. We also, each of us brings a different specialty into our camp, and that's why teamwork is so important here. Not all of us are good at everything in the field, but each one of us is really great at a different thing. So my colleague Jeff down in the bottom here, he's a grass specialist, and so he'll take over looking at grasses, while me and my colleague Lynn will look at the other things, the things with showy flowers. We have people who work on mosses, like my colleague Jennifer and my colleague Roger, who keeps us all on track and logistically fulfilled the entire time we're there. He makes sure we've got our tents, our food, and he also often makes sure to remind us that, oh, we need to be moving camp on a given day. So teamwork is really important when you're doing Arctic fieldwork. So we'll spend each one of our days out on the land collecting different plants. And you might notice that I actually am carrying a shotgun here. There's a very important reason for that, is because even though we are far out on the land, away from a lot of settlements, that doesn't mean that there aren't a lot of polar bears wandering around. And yes, polar bears are actually a real thing when you're up working on the land in the Arctic. And so we make sure to take precautions whenever we're working there. So we go out, we hike, we'll grab our specimens and we'll press them just like this. And I see the classrooms here. Who has pressed a plant in a book before? Just a quick show of hands. I'm sure a few of you have for arts and crafts at some point, maybe.
Yeah, a few hands.
Yeah, I see a few hands. All right, so essentially I get paid to do this. This is my job. I get to go out and collect plants and press them to make those herbarium specimens that I was showing you earlier. And once they're pressed and dried, these flat plants last for hundreds of years. In fact, we have specimens here from over 300 years ago. And so, as long as we keep them in the right conditions, they'll be here to be used for research for centuries to come. And as you can tell, in a month, we probably end up collecting quite a bit while we're out in the land. In fact, sometimes we collect a little too much and we bite off a little more than we can chew. And so that's essentially what I do. And I wanted to show you all a little bit of what the Arctic is like in more depth, especially the high Arctic, which is a little harder to get to. So we've got places like here, as is Axel Heiberg Island in the Canadian High Arctic. This is a place where they actually do research on what it would be like to look for different types of life on Mars. They actually have done research at the station about what kind of life could survive in extreme environments. This is Eureka. This is that place that I said was very well collected here. And Eureka has got these amazing mountains that are so tall that the fog actually starts to roll off of them. And it's really spectacular in this area. And lastly, I want to show you Ellesmere Island. This is Hazen Camp. This is about 100 kilometers south of the most northern tip of Canada. And even in such a remote part of the Canadian Arctic, you still get these beautiful flowers. And I just wanted to show you all a little bit about the Arctic, mostly because most people don't get to see it, unfortunately, but also maybe to inspire you to eventually try to get up there one day on your own, or as part of your research or on a school trip, to see it for yourself, because it is a really, truly special place. So I mentioned that we do a lot of field work. Over the last 10 years, we have visited all these different places in the Canadian Arctic and added over 16,000 new herbarium sheets, not only to our collection here, but collections at different institutions across the country and across the continent. And we'll keep on doing this until we filled in all of those gaps in our Arctic plant knowledge. And so that really is kind of what I do for a living. So I wanted to thank you all for your attention. Of course, when we're out there collecting plants, there's lots of animals around, so they're paying attention to me as much as I'm paying attention to the plants. And I wanted to open the floor to your questions because I hope there'll be lots. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. That was spectacular. What great pictures. I want to kick us off before we dive into the questions with what happened with that wolf poking its head in your tent door?
That's a very good question. So this happened 2017, so about 3 years ago. I was out in camp on Hazen Island with Ellesmere Island at Hazen Camp with my colleague Troy. When we arrived quite late, and so we didn't get our tent set up till about midnight and settled in. And about an hour later, I woke up and there was this white face in front of my head. So this is at 2 a.m. I should mention that, that we're in the land of the midnight sun. Because of the way the summers work in the Arctic, the sun never goes down. So I see this face in front of me, this white face, and I immediately book it to the back of my tent. And as soon as I realized it wasn't a polar bear, which is a very real thing, that's when I felt comfortable enough to take out my camera and shoot this wolf poking its head in my tent. And yeah, it's not every day you get something like that happens.
I would say not. Very cool. And I'm glad you brought up the midnight sun too. That's something that is really always neat to highlight to classes about Arctic expeditions and research. All right, if you want to come out of screen share so we can see you again, before we dive in with questions with our live classes, I wanted to note we've got 3 groups watching on YouTube as well. So if you guys want to let me know where you're from, what grade you are, type in your questions. I'll take as many as I can. But let's get underway with Miss Weaver's class. If you guys want to come up first, go for it.
What is the most beautiful plant you've ever seen?
Ooh, no pressure.
I have to choose?
Yeah, well, you have to at least give us an example of a really, really beautiful plant if you can't choose.
All right. Actually, you know what? I'm going to show you. So my favorite plant, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? Please keep this in mind. But I'll just screen share this.
Yeah. I'm excited. The anticipation is building.
I'm building this one up. Mountain sorrel, Oxyria digina, and this is what it looks like here. And you might think that this isn't the most spectacular looking Arctic plant, but it's special for me in a few ways. You can find it across the Arctic. There are lots of plants that you can only see in 1 or 2 locations in the Arctic. You'll find this one everywhere you go. The second one, and this one I think is more important to me, is this is edible. This is an Arctic plant that you can eat, and it is chock full of vitamin C. Inuit have been using this as part of their diet for thousands of years, and often I'll munch on a few leaves as we're pressing it. Now I don't want to eat the whole specimen, but I'll just have a few pieces here and there because it's so refreshing and nice to eat. And not to mention nutritious too. So I think maybe that would be my answer.
Okay, I like it. Very cool. All right, let's head to Miss Nilvo's class. If you guys have a question, come on up.
What were you researching when doing the Mars expedition as an analog astronaut?
And you have to explain a little bit about that because you guys have done your research. So Paul.
Oh, fantastic. Well, actually, no, in New Mexico, you're relatively close to where I was doing that kind of work. Okay, so to explain to everyone else, I have this weird Martian side hustle. So essentially, in addition to my research in the Arctic, I also am doing work at a station in Utah called the Mars Desert Research Station, which is a place where people go to simulate what it's like to live and work on the surface of Mars. And the idea here being that, we practice as much as we can here on Earth. It's going to be that much easier when we finally send people to do scientific expeditions on the red planet. And so what I ended up doing when I was on Mars was actually, here, I'm just going to pull up that too, because the nice thing about screen share is you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Essentially, I did what you would do on the surface of Mars, of course, and I collected plants, which makes so much sense, right? Now, no, there are going to be no actual plants on the surface of Mars, but any information that we can collect that tells us more about this place as an analog will give us more information on, is it really a good approximation of Mars, and what can we expect to find there when we're looking for the signs of extreme life. And so this is actually the paper I ended up writing. This is my favorite paper ever because I got to put this photo in it, which is essentially what the Mars Desert Research Station is. And so this is outside of Hanksville in southeast Utah, which is probably pretty close to you in New Mexico, or at least not far, a lot closer than the rest of us. And it really does kind of look like the surface of Mars there. And so I spent about a week collecting plants the whole time, pressing them just like I did when I was in the Arctic, except the fun part was I actually got to do it while wearing a spacesuit. So that was kind of that project.
Awesome question, guys. And way to do your research ahead of time. I really appreciate that. All right, let's go to Miss Melika's class in Ottawa. Come on up, guys.
What was your favorite animal in Arctic?
Favorite animal for a botanist? Let's do it.
Oh, no, I like it. Arctic foxes, hands down. They're cute. They're a lot. They're kind of smaller than your average fox. They're about yay big. It's hard to get an approximation because they'll come close to you, but not too close, which is smart. But they're really well adapted to their environment. You know, they molt and they turn white in winter. They're kind of gray in summer. And I always, you know, whenever I see them around, I always think it's an interesting kind of experience because I don't know, they hide a lot here in urban Ottawa, right? You know, we have foxes here, you don't see them a lot. Up in the tundra, they're not as used to people, and so they'll just come right up to you. So yeah, that's my answer. And wolves are okay, you know.
I mean, they startle you when you arrive in the middle of the night, so that's to be a mark against them.
Exactly.
All right, let's go to Glenn, Mr. Phone's class. If you guys have a question, come on up. And if anyone's too shy, that's okay too. I know you're high schoolers. It's totally fine. Oh, we got someone. Okay. Go for it. Come up to the computer and ask away. Oh, is your mic not working? Yeah, I can't hear you guys at all. So, okay. If you have any questions, type them in the chat bar. We'll keep going to our other classes and we'll see you guys everything in a little bit. Miss Weaver's class, come on back up and go for it.
You only study Arctic plants in summer months, and do you ever go there in the winter?
That's a good question. So whenever we go to study Arctic plants, it's probably about half inside a settlement and then half out on the land. So, you know, further afield where we need a helicopter to get there, when we might be, you know, hundreds of miles away from the nearest community. Yeah, no, it's important to do both. And the reason is because further out on the land, you'll be able to visit different habitats that might not have been visited before. But doing in the community means that you're looking at changes that are happening as people travel north. You know, so the Arctic is still a remote place, but it wasn't quite as remote. It's not quite as remote as it used to be. And people are going there more and more for research, for work. And so they're likely to maybe accidentally bring in introduced plant species with them. So by keeping an eye on the communities, we're kind of monitoring for weeds as we go. And to answer your second question about have I gone there in winter, I haven't yet, but I'd really like to, because I feel like that would kind of make the experience whole for me. You know, I'd actually get to see the Arctic, what it's like the other time of the year, but it's also a good time to meet with the communities as well and to consult on ongoing projects.
I actually wanted to stress at the beginning of your presentation, you did a really thoughtful and wonderful speech on the fact that, you know, these are places where people live and have lived for thousands of years, and you highlighted the communities and you spoke the language very well. And so that was really touching and nice and not something we see from a lot of our speakers. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
All right. Mr. Pone's class has figured out their mic, we think. Hey, okay.
Can you hear us?
Yes, we can. Let's do it.
Good. Go ahead, Jaden.
I was gonna ask if you noticed any change in the types of plants since you've been doing it for like a little bit.
Yeah.
That's a really good question, and one that we get quite a bit actually. What kind of changes are we seeing? And the answer is, for us, we're not necessarily seeing them so much because we're going to different areas all the time, collecting and really trying to build an overall baseline across the Canadian Arctic. However, our colleagues who live in the communities there, they're the ones who are really telling us about the changes they see. A lot of elders in the communities that we go to tell us that even within their lives, they're seeing, you know, plants grow bigger than they used to be. They're seeing new plants that they might not necessarily have seen before. And importantly, they're seeing permafrost give way in a lot of areas that they are traditionally have gone to for water or hunting. And so, you know, it's a lot of this change that we're seeing is really people who live there who are seeing it. And a lot of that is, it's really interesting because you get these reports from the ground, but also, you know, we have satellite imagery that's telling us that certain parts of the Arctic are getting greener and have been by comparing satellite imagery through time, but also certain parts are getting browner as things die off. And so really what we're seeing is across the board, new plants coming in. Some plants are doing better, some plants are doing worse. But the Arctic is changing at a huge, massive rate. And so much so that people who live there full time are seeing it before their very eyes.
Yeah, great question, guys. All right, let's head back to Miss Nilvo's class. If you guys have a second, go for it.
Have you had anything scary happen when in the Arctic?
Anything scary? That's a great question. Well, the wolf was pretty scary, I won't lie. You don't expect to see a giant wolf stick its head in your tent at 2 a.m. At least I don't. I mean, now I might, I'll be like, okay, any wolves around? I've never had a bear come close. And I think that would probably be the scariest thing because, bears can be a little unpredictable. They're these massive things. We are in their home. We just want to give them a wide berth. But I think the scariest thing that ever happened, and I think I scared myself more than anything in this, was we were moving our camps using a helicopter. And the helicopter couldn't take all of us in one go. And so a couple of our colleagues went in the first helicopter, and me and my friend were in the second helicopter, and we had to wait at camp and wait for him to go and take our colleagues over to the new camp and come back. And as we were waiting there, the fog started to roll in. And in the Arctic, if there's any fog, the helicopter can't land at all. It's not safe. And so we were just wondering, is the helicopter going to come back for us? Or are we going to be stuck here at our old camp for weeks? Because sometimes the fog can roll in and stay in. But the helicopter came down just in the nick of time, took us away, and we were able to get out. And so, things that we think about like weather, which don't affect us so much down here in the southern part of North America, can really affect you up north. And that kind of gave me a little bit of a fright. Yeah. Other than that, no, maybe running out of chocolate after the second week. That was a bit scary.
So next time so what year was that you ran out of chocolate? Now do you just pack much more? Like, what's the plan?
I always pack more, and I always don't tell everyone about all the chocolate I've packed. I have it in several different bags. So, there's always surprise chocolate.
It's good that this is a secret on YouTube right now so that they'll never know when they go on expeditions with you.
They'll never find it.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. All right, back to Ottawa, Ms. Melika's class. Come on up, guys.
What was the temperature like in Mars?
Okay. So this is back when I was doing my simulation in Utah. So it was November, so it was probably around 10 degrees Celsius. However, if we were actually on the surface of Mars, it would be much, much, much colder than that. We're talking minus 70, minus 80 degrees Celsius. And so, I think it would be a lot less comfortable than a Utah winter.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, Mr. Pone's class, now that we know the mic works, come on and ask another. If you have one.
Have you ever collected plants and lichens in Antarctica?
That's a great question. I haven't, but I really like to. I'd really, really like to. So if you're going, please, take me. No, it's definitely something that's on the bucket list. There are actually only right now 3 plant species that grow in Antarctica. There are lots of mosses and lichens, but in terms of things like grasses, there are only 3. And so, you could take me down there and then I'd get pretty bored pretty quickly, but I still love to do it.
I always love sharing this story because, talking about Antarctica, it's one of the most inhospitable environments in the world. And if you go there's a place called the Dry Valleys in Antarctica. And if you crack open rocks in the dry valleys, it's like negative 50, howling winds all year long, you crack open rocks, there are lichens inside of them. So you've got these incredible organisms that can survive the worst that the earth can throw at it. And so for that reason, Paul, I don't know, would you be bored? I know there's few, but they're so cool.
No, I'd probably find things to do. And actually, that's a really good point that you brought up about the dry valleys, because those are used also as Martian analogs. People look for life in them as a way to say, okay, well, where should we be looking on Mars for life? And so, that ties into that other thing that I do.
Outstanding. We are whipping through these guys. So I'm going to do another round of questions. We're only at the half-hour mark. So Miss Weaver's class, come on back up. Go for it. Great questions, by the way, to everyone. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to say a really fantastic question so far.
Have you ever found a plant that you could not figure out what it was?
Have I ever found a plant? All the time. It's great actually because it forces me to expand my knowledge about different plants that grow in different areas. And so, you know, sometimes I have to be really careful because maybe I don't know it personally, but you know, my colleague down the way, he's like, oh yeah, this is this thing. Or I have another colleague, Lynn Gillespie. She's been at the museum for almost 30 years. So she knows so many different plants that I could just be like, hey, Lynn, what's this? However, every once in a while, you come across a plant specimen that you're like, this is something different. And this might in fact be, you know, new to an area, which we would call a range extension, you know, found outside its normal biological range. But every once in a while, it might actually be new to science, like a previously undescribed species. And in those cases, that becomes a bigger project where I bring in people who work on things like DNA and they can help me figure that out. So it happens every once in a while, but you know, I think 99% of the time I'm looking at a specimen, we can figure out pretty quickly what it is.
Right, very cool. I just want to note too, we've got 5 groups watching on YouTube now, so don't be shy. If you guys have any questions, you want to type in questions, please do. We're doing one more round of questions the next 5 minutes or so. Just send us anything and we'll happily pass it along. Quick follow-up before we keep going with our live classes, Paul. So for DNA, these specimen sort of platings that you're making, you can extract DNA from those long into the future, right? Like they will keep able to do that.
That's right. So as part of storing them here, we're keeping them dry, we keep them dark. Essentially, they're in what's not a refrigerator, but it's a pretty like close approximation of something that would keep it stable for a long period of time. And so we've been able to extract DNA from plant specimens that are over 100 years old. And you know, people are expanding this all the time, trying to figure out a new outer limit. We also have here a brand new facility where we're storing DNA samples in liquid nitrogen. And so we call this the National Biodiversity Cryobank of Canada. So we have these freezers lined up in this hall, and we have thousands of plant and animal tissue samples in these specimens that, you know, it's almost like my colleague describes it as like the temperature of the dark side of the moon. And that's a useful resource for extracting DNA in the future. And so, you know, we can get things the traditional way, and then we have this new high-tech way of doing it.
Yeah. Speaking of him, we want to get Roger in on this, so let's get him at the end.
I will talk to him.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. I'm going to go, Miss Nillo's class, I'm actually going to come to you guys last. So I'm going to go to Miss Melika's class first. If you guys want to come up for a question, go for it.
What was it like landing on Mars?
What was it like landing on Mars?
Yeah.
Well, he didn't actually land on Mars, right? It's an analog. It's a...
It was pretend Mars, so it was a little anticlimactic. Like I was in the Range Rover, and like we came over the bump, and we were there.
Cool.
Still very cool. And in fact, I will say that that's probably one of my favorite places, hands down, ever, because of how remote and interesting it is.
Yeah,
but
a chance to go to the southwestern U.S. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm. And I am also volunteering for a real Mars trip, just to put that out there.
Okay. It's in the books. Awesome. We did have a question from a group online. So Miss McMechan's class at grade 7s in Toronto wanted to ask, Paul, have you ever come across a polar bear while searching for plants in the Arctic? So.
Okay, that's a great question. I've never come face to face with one on the ground, and I'm completely okay with this. You know, like I said, I want to give them a wide berth. I want to see them from a far, far distance. So a couple years ago, I was on an expedition called Students on Ice, which takes high school students from around the world on polar expeditions. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that after. We were supposed to land at this place called Dundas Harbor, which is a former settlement in the Arctic. And as soon as we got close to shore, a polar bear pops its head out of the house, this house in the settlement. And we were all like, we're not going there. We had to turn back and go back to the ship.
Well, at least you popped it out before you got there. That is a good sign, right? Like it's better than...
That's a very good sign. And I was actually the bear guard that day. So I was like, I'm totally okay with this, not having to actually like deal with this.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Mr. Pone's class, if you guys have another one, come on up.
What kind of plants would transplant to Mars? Transplant?
Yeah, you're going to take plants to Mars. Which ones would you take? Good question.
That's a great question. And in fact, I think there are a lot of people who are working on this. People think, are we going to grow things in Martian soil? And I think the answer for the immediate and probably long term is no. And the reason is that Martian soil is full of toxic chemicals called perchlorates. They're nasty for us. We really don't want any part of it. So whatever we end up taking to Mars will be things that work well in hydroponics. So things like lettuce, strawberries, radishes, cucumbers, those are things that we can grow pretty quickly using just water and nutrients. And I think those are the things we'll probably end up taking with us.
Yeah, super cool question, guys.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to note, I don't know for the class that might or might not know, the Chinese sent a mission to the other side of the moon a couple of years ago. And when it was there, they had a little sort of self-contained vessel on the capsule that landed that grew a little plant. So the first plant ever grown in another body in the solar system ever. Super cool. Not in any moon soil, but very, very neat. Paul, you're obviously interested in that too.
Yeah, that's it. Absolutely.
Do you know what kind of plant they grew?
You know what? I'm not sure off the top of my head. I do remember reading about it though, and I thought that was a pretty cool day.
Yeah, very neat. All right, before we wrap up with Ms. Nilvo's class, you want to talk about students on ice briefly, and we've got tons of time, so please explain whatever you want to talk about.
That would be great. So I talked a little bit about Students on Ice. So this is an organization that's based here in Ottawa, and this is actually their 20th anniversary this year. And what they do is every year they do a polar expedition, and they bring youth between the ages of 14 and 18 along with them. And there are tons of scholarships. There are all sorts of ways to get involved, but the most important thing is it's an educational expedition. You join experts in botany sometimes, but also specialists who work all sorts of things, on all sorts of things like polar bears, lake sediments, culture, arts, etc. It has participants from across the Inuit homeland, and it's a great way to see the Arctic. And so I hope that if you're interested in the Arctic after this presentation at all, you'll check out this program because it's a great way to get up there and to really see this special part of the planet.
I just included in the bottom for everyone, studentsonice.com, so you can check it out there. It's a really amazing program. We did a ton of sessions with Canada C3, which is an initiative of Students on Ice that Paul got a chance to be a part of, going coast to coast to coast across Canada and a bit of the US as well. So I encourage you guys to check that out. All right, let's wrap up. Ms. Nilvo's class, if you want to ask one more question, come on up and go for it.
How is matter changing in the Arctic and how it's impacting Earth?
Yeah.
Oh, I like that one actually, and that's a really good last question. So one of the biggest changes is we're losing things like sea ice and we're losing things like permafrost. And so essentially it's a phase change for ice that's either on the sea or in the ground is now changing to water, and that's, evaporating or becoming groundwater. And what we're seeing is that we've got this loss of not only productivity within the ecosystems, because the ice is host to things like polar bears and algae grows on the underside of ice, but also on the land itself where permafrost is slumping away. Literally these sheets of permafrost just kind of collapse into the tundra. We're losing habitat for different plants and animals. And so I think, as we see loss of ice, and that's the biggest matter change, we're losing habitat for Arctic biodiversity. And that's something that alarms me and something that I hope that we can work to change.
Fantastic. I'm really glad we ended on that too, Paul. Before we wrap up, actually, I just want to ask, how can kids learn more about you, about the museum, and how can they get involved in the Arctic? So you've highlighted Students on Ice, but how do we get these kids actually exploring and understanding the plants around them, or going up and doing the sort of stuff that you get to do?
Oh, well, I would actually encourage everyone. There are two ways you can do it. You can start locally and then you can go a little bigger. And so, when we're talking about plants, we don't always pay as much attention to them in our everyday lives as we might want to, or at least not as much as I do. But obviously, I'm a giant dork about plants. Try paying attention to your plants in your community and try seeing if you can learn a few of the names of the plants that grow around you. And as you do that, you'll kind of discover there's more biodiversity around you. Now, if you're interested in the Arctic, check out our website. It's nature.ca, and it has all sorts of information about the Arctic stuff we're doing, access to photos on our social media feed about what we're doing. So we're on Instagram and Twitter. And then don't hesitate to ever reach out to experts too, you know. Scientists, we're not the kind of people who just, like, some of us wear lab coats and that's great. Most of us are like, we put on a down vest and we go and do things on a normal day. And we're happy to hear from people who have questions about the Arctic, who are looking to get involved. And particularly if you're interested in volunteering or getting involved, we actually have online initiatives where you can help us by helping us enter our biodiversity data and capture that. It's on a platform called Zooniverse. It's called Expedition Canadian Arctic. And in it, you can actually help us by entering specimen table data. I know for people in Ontario, which is one class, that's a way you can also work to get your volunteer hours for your school curriculum as well.
Fantastic. And I'm going to pass along all those resources to our class when we're done. So you can look for an email with all of those and Paul's Twitter account and the Museum of Nature site and all sorts of great stuff. So you can follow along with what he's doing. And so thank you so much for this. This is a really fantastic talk. And Paul, as you know, having done one of these before, how we wrap up everything is I'm going to demute everyone's microphone. And so boys and girls, if you guys can get ready to join me in saying a huge thank you to Paul for joining us today. You are all now demuted. Go for it. Thank you so much. The best part of that for me is the one class with grade 10 and 12 and are like 8 octaves lower than all the others. So thank you for that. Paul, that was fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure.
All right. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And to all the classes, we look really forward to seeing you guys soon. Do check out that email with other great resources and come back in February, an entire month dedicated to amazing women in science, starting in just a few days.